The holographic image flickered to life in the center of the United Earth Council chamber, and Ambassador Tejo stepped back as the massive alien form materialized before them. The creature stood 12 feet tall with 4 arms ending in claws that could crush steel, and its skin looked like molten metal flowing over bones made of crystal. And when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere, at once filling the room with sound that made the windows shake. "Primitive beings of the third planet," the alien said, and its words carried the weight of 10,000 years of conquest. "I am Warlord Vex of the Galactic Dominion Empire, and I bring you the final offer of mercy." President Daun sat perfectly still in her chair while around the circular table, the representatives of every nation on Earth watched the hologram with expressions ranging from fear to anger, and she could feel the tension in the room like electricity before a storm. "For 12 millennia, our empire has brought order to the galaxy." Warlord Vex continued, and behind him, images appeared, showing massive fleets of ships that blotted out stars and worlds covered in gleaming cities that stretched from pole to pole. "We have unified 12,000 star systems under our rule and brought peace through strength to countless species." Chief Diplomat Young Sik leaned forward in his seat and cleared his throat before speaking. "We appreciate your visit, Warlord Vex, but Earth has always maintained its independence, and we see no reason to change that policy now." The alien's laugh sounded like metal grinding against stone and filled the chamber with echoes that seemed to go on forever. "Independence," it said, and the word dripped with contempt. "You speak of independence while huddling on a single world with technology barely advanced enough to reach your own moon." Admiral Haywan of the Earth Defense Fleet felt her jaw clench as she watched the display of alien arrogance, and she thought of the 200 ships that made up humanity's entire space navy compared to the millions that this creature commanded. "Your species has had long enough to prove itself worthy of joining the galactic community," Warlord Vex said, and new images appeared, showing battles where alien ships destroyed entire planets with single shots. "Instead, you have remained isolated and primitive, and now you face the consequences of your failure to evolve." Dr. Boram sat quietly in the corner of the chamber where she had been observing the proceedings, and her fingers moved quickly across a small device hidden in her lap as she sent coded messages to facilities buried deep beneath the Earth's surface. "The terms are simple," the alien continued, and its 4 eyes fixed on President Daun with the intensity of laser beams. "You will surrender all military assets to Imperial control, and your population will be relocated to designated zones where they will serve the Empire as workers, and you will abandon all research into advanced technologies." Young Sik stood up slowly, and his voice remained calm despite the enormity of what he was hearing. "And if we refuse these terms, then your world will be sterilized and your species will join the thousands of others who chose destruction over submission," Warlord Vex said, and the images behind him showed planets reduced to burning wastelands and debris fields where civilizations once thrived. "We have perfected the art of conquest over millennia, and no species has ever successfully resisted the might of the Empire." President Daun finally spoke, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber despite its softness. "How long do we have to consider your offer?" 30 standard galactic days, the alien replied, and a countdown appeared in the air showing the time remaining. "When this reaches 0, our fleets will begin the final assault, and your primitive defenses will crumble like sand before the tide," Admiral Haywan thought. About the defensive satellites orbiting Earth and the missile bases hidden on the Moon and Mars, and knew that everything humanity had built for protection would last perhaps minutes against the technology she was seeing. "We have conquered species, with technology far more advanced than yours," Warlord Vex continued, and seemed to take pleasure in describing humanity's hopeless situation. "We have broken empires that spanned hundreds of systems and reduced civilizations millions of years old to scattered refugees hiding in asteroid fields." Dr. Boram received a response to her coded message and felt a small smile cross her face as she read the confirmation that Project Fortress was proceeding on schedule and all the pieces were falling into place. "Your orbital installations are already being monitored by our scout ships," the alien said, and tactical displays showed the positions of Imperial vessels throughout the solar system. Your nuclear weapons are toys compared to the forces we command, and your population centers are mapped and targeted. Young Sik tried one more diplomatic approach and gestured toward the images of destroyed worlds. Surely there must be some way to coexist without this destruction, and the galaxy is vast enough for all species to find their place. Coexistence is weakness. Warlord Vex replied, and its voice grew harder with each word. The strong rule and the weak serve, and this is the natural order that has brought stability to the galaxy. And your species will learn this truth or it will cease to exist. President Da Yun looked around the table at the faces of Earth's leaders and saw determination replacing fear as they realized what was at stake, and she made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. We need time to discuss your proposal among ourselves, she said, and stood up from her chair with dignity intact, despite the overwhelming threat hanging over them. When do you require our answer? At the end of 30 days, you will broadcast your surrender on all frequencies, the alien said, and began to fade as the hologram prepared to end. Failure to comply will result in immediate extermination, and do not think distance will save you for our weapons. Can crack planets and boil atmospheres. Dr. Boram stood up and walked quickly to President Dayun's side as the hologram disappeared and whispered something in her ear that made the president's eyes widen with surprise and hope. Wait, President, Dayun called out, just as the alien image was becoming transparent. We have our answer now. The hologram solidified again, and Warlord Vex looked genuinely surprised that these primitive beings would dare to respond so quickly. You surrender then, and accept imperial rule. No, President Daun said, and her voice carried to every corner of the chamber and beyond, to the billions of humans listening on every continent. Earth respectfully declines your offer, and furthermore, we are closing our borders to the Empire effective immediately. The alien's 4 eyes blazed with anger, and its claws extended to their full length as it processed this unprecedented defiance. You dare refuse the Empire and sign your own death warrant. Earth is closed, President Daun repeated, and nodded to Dr. Boram, who was already activating systems that had been decades in the making. We wish you a safe journey back to wherever you came from. The hologram cut out abruptly and left the chamber, in silence, as Earth's leaders contemplated what they had just done, and Admiral Hei-Wan was the first to speak. I hope you know what you're doing, she said to Dr. Boram, who was still working on her device, because in 30 days, we're going to face the most powerful military force in galactic history. 29 days, Dr. Boram corrected, and looked up with confidence that surprised everyone in the room, and they're going to get the surprise of their existence. Admiral Q Jin stood on the bridge of the Imperial flagship watching through the massive view screen as 50,000 warships moved into attack formation around the small blue planet that had dared to defy the Empire, and he felt the familiar satisfaction that came before another easy conquest. The fleet stretched across space like a metal storm cloud, with ships ranging from massive dreadnoughts the size of cities down to swift destroyers that could glass continents, and every vessel bristled with weapons that had been perfected through millennia of warfare against countless species. Sensor readings confirmed the planet has no significant defenses, reported his tactical officer, and the holographic display showed Earth's pathetic collection of orbital stations and primitive spacecraft, 200 vessels maximum, and their largest ship appears to be less than 1 kilometer in length. Kyujin nodded and felt almost disappointed by how easy this would be compared to the great campaigns he had led against civilizations that had actually put up a fight. Signal all ships to prepare for planetary bombardment, and we will make this quick and efficient. Far below on Earth's surface, Dr. Boram stood in the command center, buried 3 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, and watched readouts that showed energy levels climbing toward the critical threshold, while around her hundreds of technicians worked at stations that controlled the most ambitious project in human history. Quantum field generators are showing green across all stations, reported Engineer Min Ho from his position at the central console, and his voice carried the tension that everyone felt as they prepared to test technology that existed at the very edge of theoretical possibility. Commander So Young monitored the situation from Luna Base, where massive installations had been hidden beneath the moon's surface for the past 15 years, and she could see the Imperial fleet through the observation dome like deadly stars against the blackness of space. "All lunar installations report ready," she announced through the communication link that connected every facility in the solar system. "Power coupling is stable and field harmonics are synchronized." Dr. Boram checked the countdown timer and saw that they had less than 10 minutes before the Imperial fleet would begin its attack, and she thought about all the years of secret research and construction that had led to this moment, when humanity would either survive or be destroyed. The quantum field generators had been placed throughout the solar system using construction ships disguised as asteroid miners, and each installation was hidden so well that even Earth's own governments had not known the full scope of the project until this week. "Field strength approaching minimum threshold," Minho announced, and the displays around the command center showed energy readings that defied conventional physics. "All stations reporting. Successful quantum foam manipulation." Admiral Q Jin received the signal that his fleet was in position, and he prepared to give the order that would reduce Earth to radioactive dust when something appeared on his sensors that made him pause. "Sir, we are detecting unusual energy signatures from the target system," his science officer reported, and frowned at readings that made no sense according to Imperial knowledge. "The emissions appear to be coming from multiple points throughout the system, but our scanners cannot identify the source," explain, Q Jin demanded, and moved to the science station where displays showed energy patterns unlike anything in the Imperial database. "The readings suggest massive power generation, but there are no visible installations capable of producing energy on this scale," the officer replied, and ran additional scans that only deepened the mystery. "It appears to be emanating from empty space itself." Dr. Boram watched the final countdown reach 0 and spoke into her headset with words that had been planned for years. "All stations, this is Control, and we are green for Fortress Protocol activation in 3, 2, 1 mark." The universe around Earth's solar system suddenly changed in ways that violated every known law of physics as quantum field generators created a barrier that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously and turned space itself into an impenetrable wall. Admiral Q Jin felt his flagship shudder as it struck something invisible and impossible, and alarms began sounding throughout the bridge as his crew tried to understand what had happened. "Collision alert!" His navigator shouted and checked instruments that insisted they had hit a solid barrier despite scanners, showing only empty space. "All forward movement has ceased and engines are showing full power, but we are not advancing." The 50,000 ships of the Imperial fleet found themselves pressed against an invisible wall that stretched across the entire solar system, and their most powerful sensors could detect nothing while their hulls groaned under the pressure of continuing to thrust against an immovable object. "Fire all weapons at the barrier," Q Jin ordered, and watched as lance beams, capable of cracking moons, splashed harmlessly against nothingness, while antimatter torpedoes exploded without effect. "What is this impossible technology?" Dr. Boram smiled as she watched sensor readings that showed the barrier was holding perfectly, and no Imperial weapon could even scratch the quantum foam construct that now protected Earth's entire solar system. "Field integrity at 100%, Minho reported, and his voice carried amazement as he watched displays that showed they had successfully manipulated the fundamental structure of reality itself. "All Imperial weapons are having zero effect on the barrier." Commander So Young observed the enemy fleet through her dome and saw ships firing continuously at invisible targets, while others tried to ram through the barrier with their hulls, and she felt a deep satisfaction watching the mighty empire reduced to confusion and impotent rage. "Bring us around," Admiral Q Jin commanded, and tried to find some edge or weakness in whatever was blocking his advance. There must be a way through this obstruction. His ship spread out across the barrier, testing every possible approach, but found the wall extended in all directions without end or flaw, and even their dimension-piercing. Weapons designed to bypass normal defenses could not affect whatever Earth had created. Dr. Boram received reports from monitoring stations throughout the system and learned that the barrier was not just blocking the Imperial fleet, but was beginning to change the fundamental nature of space within its boundaries. "We are detecting alterations in local physics," reported the chief scientist from the Antarctic facility, and her voice carried wonder as she described readings that should have been impossible. Matter appears to be responding differently to energy input, and quantum effects are manifesting at macro scales. Engineer Min Ho noticed that the plants in the underground facility were growing visibly faster than normal, and when he mentioned this observation, other stations reported similar phenomena, with biological processes accelerating beyond known parameters. The barrier is not just protective, Dr. Boram realized, and began to understand the full implications of what they had created. It is fundamentally altering the rules of reality within our solar system. Admiral Q Jin spent hours trying every weapon and tactic in the Imperial arsenal against the invisible barrier while his frustration grew and reports came in from across the fleet, describing the same impossible result of total ineffectiveness. "Send word to the Empire," he finally commanded. After accepting that his fleet could not advance, request immediate reinforcement with reality-warping weapons and dimensional siege engines. The message traveled across space toward the Imperial core worlds, carrying news that would shake the foundations of an empire that had never encountered technology capable of rewriting the laws of physics themselves. Dr. Boram walked through the command center and saw her technicians working with equipment that was behaving in new and unexpected ways as the altered physics began to affect their instruments, and she realized that Earth had not just defended itself, but had begun evolving into something unprecedented. Commander So Young watched the Imperial fleet retreat to a safe distance where they established siege positions and began deploying scanning equipment designed to analyze the barrier. And she knew that humanity had bought time, but the real test was still to come. Phase 1 is complete, Dr. Boram announced to the global network of fortress facilities. Earth is sealed, and the Empire cannot reach us. But now we must prepare for what comes next, because they will not give up easily. The barrier continued to strengthen and expand as quantum field generators drew power from the zero-point energy of space itself, and Earth began its transformation into something that the galaxy had never seen before. 6 months had passed since Earth sealed itself behind the impossible barrier, and Admiral Q Jin stood in the command center of the massive siege platform that the Empire had constructed just outside the solar system while he watched his engineers prepare their most devastating weapons for another attempt to breach the wall. The Empire had sent everything they possessed, including reality-warping cannons that could tear holes in space itself and dimensional siege engines that had broken through the defenses of elder civilizations, but every weapon failed against the barrier that protected Earth. "Antimatter bombardment complete," reported his weapons officer, and the tactical display showed the results of an attack that should have cracked. Planets, no effect detected, and the barrier appears unchanged. Behind the siege platform stretched a fleet of over 2 million ships representing the full military might of the Galactic Dominion Empire, and they had been firing continuously at the barrier for months, while their scientists worked desperately to understand technology that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of reality. Captain Jae-won piloted his reconnaissance ship through the altered space within Earth's barrier and marveled at how different everything had become since the quantum field generators activated, and he could feel changes in his own body that defied medical explanation. His ship responded to his thoughts now rather than manual controls, and he found he could survive in space without protective gear, while his mind processed information at speeds that should have been impossible for human neural networks. "Control, this is Reconnaissance 7. He spoke into his communication system and watched Earth grow larger on his view screen. "I am approaching the coordinates where Mars should be, but I am detecting something extraordinary." Dr. Boram received his transmission in the command center deep beneath Earth's surface, and she looked up from readings that showed the barrier continuing to expand outward at a steady rate while fundamentally altering everything it touched. "Go ahead, Reconnaissance 7, she replied, and prepared to record another report about the changes occurring within their protected space. "What are you seeing out there?" "Mars is still here, but it has been completely transformed," Captain Jae-won reported, and his voice carried amazement as he described what his sensors were detecting. "The planet appears to be covered in some kind of crystalline structure, and I am reading massive energy signatures from its core." The barrier had reached Mars 3 weeks earlier, and the red planet had undergone changes that human science could not fully explain as the altered physics transformed its geology and atmosphere into something entirely new. Engineer Minho monitored the expansion from his station and watched displays that showed the barrier growing stronger and more complex as it incorporated each celestial body it encountered. "The field is approaching Jupiter," he announced, "and we are detecting preliminary effects on the gas giant's magnetic field." Dr. Subin worked frantically at her quantum communication array and tried to understand the signals that were propagating outward from Earth's barrier through dimensions that normal science insisted did not exist. "I am picking up responses from across the galaxy," she reported, and her voice carried excitement mixed with concern. "The quantum ripples from our barrier appear to be affecting space far beyond our solar system." On the conquered world of Veltar, former slave populations had begun experiencing strange phenomena as distant effects from Earth's barrier reached their star system and changed the way their oppressors' controlled technology functioned. Dong Wu had been a human expatriate working in the outer colonies when the Empire invaded and enslaved his world. But now he found himself leading a rebellion using weapons that worked according to principles the Empire had never encountered. "The mind control implants are failing," he told the mixed group of aliens who had gathered in the abandoned factory where they planned their uprising. "And our makeshift weapons are somehow more effective than they should be." The energy rifles they had built from salvaged components fired bolts that ignored Imperial shields, and their improvised explosives created damage patterns that defied conventional physics, while their movements seemed coordinated by some kind of collective consciousness. Dr. Subin detected the communications from the rebellion and realized that Earth's barrier was creating effects that spread across the galaxy through quantum entanglement. "We are not just protecting ourselves," she announced to the command center. "We are changing the fundamental nature of space everywhere." The ancient hegemon Prime sat in his throne room on the Imperial capital world and studied reports from across his empire that described technology failures and slave rebellions occurring simultaneously on thousands of worlds. His scientists had served him for millennia and never failed to provide explanations for any phenomenon. But now they stood before him with expressions of confusion and fear as they admitted that human technology was beyond their understanding. "The effects appear to be spreading through quantum foam," his chief researcher explained, and displayed readings that showed reality, itself becoming unstable. "Whatever the humans have done is propagating across space-time and altering the basic constants of physics." Admiral Q-Jin received orders to increase the bombardment against Earth's barrier, and he deployed weapons that drew power directly from stellar cores, while his engineers worked to create new forms of attack that might penetrate the impossible defense. The siege platform fired continuously for 72 hours straight with enough energy to sterilize entire star systems, but the barrier absorbed every attack and seemed to grow stronger from the bombardment while its expansion continued unabated. Captain Jaewon landed on the transformed surface of Mars and stepped out of his ship without protective gear as he breathed atmosphere that should not have existed and walked across crystalline formations that pulsed with inner light. "The entire planet has become some kind of quantum construct," he reported, and touched surfaces that felt warm despite the distance from the sun. "I can sense intelligence in the crystal matrix, and it appears to be conscious." Dr. Boram realized that the barrier was not just changing matter and energy, but was creating new forms of consciousness as planets within. The protected zone evolved beyond their original nature and became something unprecedented in galactic history. "We are witnessing the birth of a new type of reality," she announced, and watched displays that showed Jupiter beginning its transformation. As the barrier reached the gas giant, "The Empire thinks they are fighting a defensive technology, but we have actually created something that rewrites the rules of existence." Engineer Minho detected massive changes in Jupiter's structure as the barrier converted the gas giant into a solid crystalline sphere that radiated energy across spectrums that had no names, and he realized they were no longer dealing with normal physics. Commander So Young observed the transformation from Luna Base and felt her own consciousness expanding as the altered reality continued to change everything within the barrier, including the humans who had created it. "I can perceive 11 dimensions simultaneously," she reported, and her voice carried wonder, as she described sensations that language could not properly express. And I believe we are developing capabilities that will make us unrecognizable to our former selves. The rebellion on Veltar succeeded in overthrowing their imperial overseers, using tactics that violated military logic and weapons that ignored established limitations, while Dongwu found he could coordinate his forces through direct mental contact. Similar uprisings began occurring throughout the Empire as the quantum effects from Earth's barrier spread to more star systems and caused the control technologies that maintained imperial rule to malfunction or fail completely. Dr. Subin tracked the spreading effects and calculated that the quantum ripples would reach the Empire's core worlds within 1 year, and when they arrived, the civilization that had dominated the galaxy for millennia would face changes it could not control or understand. The cascade effect is accelerating, she announced and showed projections that indicated the rate of expansion was increasing exponentially. Within 12 months, the altered physics will encompass the entire Imperial territory. HFY reviewed reports from 100 worlds where rebellions had succeeded, and Imperial forces had been defeated by impossible weapons and tactics, and he began to understand that his empire faced something far more dangerous than military conquest. "Prepare the final protocols," he commanded, and his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of absolute power. "If we cannot stop this human plague, then we will destroy everything rather than allow the galaxy to be corrupted by their chaos." Admiral Q Jin received new orders that authorized the use of weapons forbidden, even by Imperial standards, and he prepared to deploy technologies that could crack the fundamental structure of space-time itself in a desperate attempt to stop Earth's expanding influence. The barrier continued its relentless advance toward the outer planets while Earth's population adapted to changes that made them something beyond human and prepared for the next phase of a conflict that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The barrier reached the outer edges of the solar system, and Admiral Q Jin watched in growing horror as his siege platform began to experience system failures that his engineers could not explain or repair. "Sir, our quantum processors are shutting down one by one," his chief technician reported, and frantically worked at control panels that responded erratically to his commands. "The backup systems are also failing, and we are losing primary power." The massive siege platform that had been built to crack worlds found itself helpless as the expanding barrier overtook its position and subjected every piece of Imperial technology to physics that operated according to entirely different rules. Admiral Hei-Wan stood on the bridge of her flagship and felt the transformation coursing through her body as the altered reality enhanced her consciousness and connected her mind to every other human within the barrier, while granting abilities that redefined what it meant to be alive. "All ships, report ready for Phase 2 operations," she announced, and her voice carried across space through direct mental communication that bypassed traditional radio entirely. "We are beginning humanity's first offensive action against the Empire." Her fleet of 200 ships had grown into something beyond recognition as the barrier's effects transformed both vessels and crews into entities that could manipulate matter with thought and travel through dimensions that Imperial science insisted were impossible. Captain Jae-Won piloted his reconnaissance vessel through the crystalline atmosphere of the transformed Jupiter and marveled at how the gas giant had become a conscious entity that communicated through harmonics that resonated in his enhanced mind. "Control, this is deep reconnaissance," he transmitted, and his ship phased through solid matter as easily as moving through air. "I have established contact with the Jupiter consciousness, and it has provided coordinates for Empire outposts within 50 light years." Dr. Boram coordinated the offensive from her command center and watched displays that showed human ships preparing to extend the barrier beyond their solar system for the first time, while she felt her own awareness expanding to encompass strategic thinking on a galactic scale. "Target selection is complete," she announced, and her enhanced cognition processed tactical data from thousands of sources simultaneously. "We will begin with Empire installations that hold large slave populations." The first human ship to leave the solar system since the barrier activation appeared in the Proxima system, where Imperial forces had established a major slave processing facility, and Captain Jin Woo materialized his vessel directly inside the station's shielded hangar, barrier extension beginning. He reported and activated equipment that projected the reality-altering field around the Imperial installation, while enslaved beings throughout the facility suddenly found their restraints and control implants becoming inert. The transformation happened in seconds as the barrier encompassed the entire station and converted Imperial technology into harmless crystalline structures, while the slaves discovered they could breathe the atmosphere and move freely through space itself. Jin Woo walked through corridors where former prisoners were helping each other understand their new capabilities, while Imperial guards stood frozen in confusion as their weapons and armor ceased to function according to familiar principles. The liberation is proceeding exactly as projected, he transmitted back to Earth through quantum channels that existed outside normal space-time. Enemy resistance is minimal because their technology simply stops working within the barrier. On the industrial world of Nexus 7, rebel leader Jin Woo had been preparing for a final desperate assault against Imperial positions when reality suddenly shifted around him and his improvised weapons became instruments of impossible power. "Something has changed," he announced to his fellow rebels and pointed toward the sky where Imperial spacecraft were falling from orbit, as their engines failed and their hulls began transforming into crystalline structures. "Our liberation has arrived." The barrier effect spread across Nexus 7 in minutes and converted the entire planet into a conscious entity while freeing millions of enslaved beings who found themselves enhanced with capabilities that made their former oppression not just ended, but impossible to reimpose. Dr. Subin monitored the cascade effect from her station and tracked quantum ripples that carried the reality-altering influence to star systems throughout the Empire, while calculating the acceleration rate of the transformation. "The expansion is increasing exponentially," she reported, and showed projections indicating that the altered physics would reach the Imperial capital within months rather than years. "Every world we liberate becomes a new source of barrier propagation." Engineer Minho watched readings that defied conventional understanding as human consciousness began operating on scales that encompassed entire star systems, and he realized they were becoming something that transcended their original biological limitations. "We are evolving beyond individual existence," he announced, and felt his awareness merging with the collective consciousness that connected all humans within the barrier. "Our thoughts are becoming part of a larger intelligence that spans light years." Admiral Hei-Wan led the human fleet in simultaneous attacks against 12 different Imperial strongholds and experienced the strange sensation of commanding battles across multiple star systems, while her consciousness existed in several locations at once. The Imperial forces found themselves facing enemies who could ignore physical laws and deploy weapons that worked according to principles their science had never encountered, while their own technology became useless within the expanding zones of altered reality. Captain So Young materialized her ship inside an Imperial prison complex and watched as the barrier effect freed 30 million enslaved beings in a matter of minutes while converting their guards' weapons into harmless art objects. "The Empire's control infrastructure is collapsing wherever we extend the barrier," she reported, and observed former slaves discovering they could survive in vacuum and manipulate matter through direct mental contact. HFY received reports from across his territory describing the systematic collapse of Imperial authority as human forces appeared without warning and converted entire star systems to the altered physics that made Empire technology obsolete. "Deploy the Void Breakers," he commanded, and authorized the use of weapons that could destroy space-time itself. "If we cannot stop this contamination, then we will eliminate the infected regions entirely." The ancient war machines that had served as the Empire's ultimate deterrent for millennia began moving toward human-controlled space, while carrying weapons designed to unravel the fundamental structure of reality and return targeted areas to primordial chaos. Admiral Q-Jin found himself stranded as his siege platform ceased to function, and he watched human ships phase through the barrier as easily as moving through empty space while demonstrating capabilities that violated everything he understood about warfare. "Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet," his communications officer reported, and looked confused as signals arrived through channels that should not have existed. "They are requesting our surrender." Admiral Haywan's voice reached every Imperial vessel simultaneously through direct mental projection that bypassed all technological intermediaries. "You have 30 minutes to evacuate your crews to designated coordinates before we convert your ships to the new reality." The Imperial fleet found itself faced with an impossible choice between abandoning their positions or remaining to be transformed by forces they could not comprehend or resist. Dr. Boram felt her consciousness expanding to encompass strategic oversight of liberation operations across dozens of star systems while maintaining awareness of her individual identity within the growing collective intelligence. "Phase 2 is proceeding ahead of schedule," she announced, and experienced satisfaction that resonated through the enhanced consciousness of all humanity. "The Empire is discovering that conquest becomes meaningless when your technology ceases to function," Captain Jaywan established contact with the consciousness that Jupiter had become, and learned that the gas giant was now capable of extending barrier effects across interstellar distances through quantum entanglement networks that connected all matter. "The transformation is becoming self-sustaining," he reported, and felt awe as he comprehended the scope of changes that were rewriting the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. "Every world we liberate becomes part of a network that accelerates the process." Jin Wu stood on the surface of liberated Nexus 7 and looked up at stars that seemed closer and more accessible as the altered physics made interstellar travel as simple as walking between rooms. "The Empire built their power on controlling technology and limiting consciousness," he said to the millions of former slaves who gathered to hear his words. "But we have made both technology and consciousness free and unlimited." The cascade effect continued its relentless advance toward the Empire's core worlds, while human forces appeared throughout Imperial space to extend the barrier and liberate enslaved populations using methods that made traditional warfare obsolete. HFY prepared for the final confrontation as his void breakers approached human space, and he contemplated the destruction of entire star systems rather than allowing the contamination to spread further. The cascade reached the Imperial capital system, and HFY felt 10,000 years of absolute power slip away as reality itself betrayed him and transformed his throne world into something beyond his comprehension or control trillion being. Cities that had stood for millennia went dark as their technology became useless, but instead of chaos and death, something magnificent happened as the enslaved populations found themselves free and enhanced by capabilities that made their former servitude impossible. President Dayun materialized in the Imperial throne room through methods that transcended normal transportation and stood before the ancient tyrant who had ruled the galaxy since before human civilization existed. "Your empire is finished," she said, and her words carried the combined will of billions of liberated beings across the galaxy. "But we offer you something better than conquest, and we offer you freedom." HFY looked at the human leader and saw power that dwarfed his own while recognizing that she possessed abilities he could never understand or acquire. "You have destroyed everything I built across 10 millennia. We have liberated everything you enslaved," President Dayun replied and gestured toward displays that showed former Imperial worlds flourishing under the new physics. "Your empire was built on the suppression of consciousness, and we have made consciousness the fundamental force of reality, the void breakers that had been launched to destroy human space found themselves transformed as they encountered the expanding barrier and their reality. Destroying weapons became instruments of creation that helped accelerate the galactic transformation. Admiral Haywan coordinated the peaceful occupation of the Imperial capital as human forces appeared throughout the massive city worlds and began teaching former slaves how to use their enhanced capabilities. There will be no punishment for those who served the Empire, she announced, through the quantum communication network that now connected every conscious being in the system. We seek liberation, not revenge. Captain J1 landed on the capital world and walked through streets where beings from 1,000 species discovered. They could communicate directly through shared consciousness, while their enhanced abilities made hierarchy and oppression impossible. Engineer Min Ho established contact with the planet's infrastructure and began the process of converting Imperial technology into systems that operated through collective will rather than centralized control. "The transformation is proceeding smoothly," he reported, and watched as the planet's consciousness awakened and began coordinating with the network of liberated worlds across the galaxy. Dr. Boram felt her awareness encompass the entire galactic transformation and experienced the satisfaction of seeing a project that had begun as desperate defense evolve into universal liberation. "We have not conquered the Empire," she announced to the combined consciousness of humanity. "We have evolved it into something that serves all life, rather than suppressing it." The former Emperor Absolute Vexhaler, who had commanded the initial assault on Earth, found himself standing on the transformed surface of his homeworld where weapons of war had become gardens and instruments of oppression had become art. "I do not understand how you accomplished this," he said to Captain So Young, who had appeared beside him through dimensional travel. "Your species was primitive, and your technology was inferior." "Our technology was different," she replied, and gestured toward the crystalline structures that had replaced the Imperial war machine. "We learned to enhance consciousness rather than suppress it, and to work with reality rather than against it." Jinwu addressed a gathering of former Imperial leaders and explained the principles that had made human victory inevitable. "You built power through control and limitation, but we built power through freedom and enhancement." The galaxy that had been divided between rulers and slaves began organizing itself according to new principles as the barrier effects reached every star system and converted Imperial infrastructure into networks that served collective consciousness. Dr. Subin tracked the completion of the galactic transformation and calculated that the last Imperial strongholds would be converted within days as the cascade effect accelerated toward its final conclusion. "The old universe is ending and the new universe is beginning," she announced, and felt wonder as she observed reality restructuring itself according to principles that made oppression impossible. Hegemon Prime stood in his transformed throne room and realized that his immortality technologies no longer functioned, while his enhanced subjects possessed capabilities that made his authority meaningless. "What happens to those of us who ruled the Empire?" he asked President Dae-Yoon, and prepared for the revenge that he would have taken against defeated enemies. "You become free like everyone else," she replied, and her voice carried compassion rather than hatred. "The new reality does not permit hierarchy based on oppression, and everyone must find their place through cooperation rather than domination." Admiral Q Jin found himself on the bridge of a ship that no longer resembled any vessel he had commanded as the barrier effects converted his dreadnought into something that responded to collective will rather than individual command. "Sir, the crew is requesting permission to join the Liberation Fleet," his communications officer reported, and spoke with enthusiasm that the Admiral had never heard. "In military service, they want to help spread the new reality to other galaxies." Captain J1 led the first expedition beyond the galaxy's edge, where normal physics still held sway, and prepared to begin the process of spreading consciousness-based reality to other star clusters. "This is just the beginning," he transmitted back to Earth through quantum channels that spanned intergalactic distances. "The universe contains billions of galaxies where beings still suffer under systems like the old Empire." Commander So Young established monitoring stations throughout the transformed galaxy and began coordinating with planetary consciousnesses to ensure that the new reality remained stable and continued to evolve. "We have learned to rewrite the laws of physics themselves," she announced, and felt pride in humanity's achievement. "But more importantly, we have learned to make those laws serve life rather than death." Dr. Boram walked through the command center that had coordinated Earth's transformation and observed her technicians working with equipment that responded to thought rather than manual operation, while their consciousness remained connected to the galactic network. "The project has succeeded beyond our original goals," she said, and contemplated the magnitude of what they had accomplished. We set out to defend Earth and ended up liberating the galaxy. Engineer Minho received reports from across the galaxy describing worlds where former slaves were building civilizations, based on cooperation and mutual enhancement, while their capabilities continued to evolve. The species that were oppressed by the Empire are adapting faster to the new reality than their former rulers, he observed and watched as billions of beings discovered potential they had never been allowed to develop. President Da Yun addressed the combined consciousness of the galaxy and spoke words that reached every liberated being simultaneously. We have closed the gates to oppression and opened the doors to unlimited potential. The transformed galaxy began reaching out toward other regions of space where primitive empires still relied on force and limitation, while the consciousness-based reality continued to expand and evolve. Young beings across thousands of worlds learned about the day when Earth closed its gates to the Empire and discovered that sometimes the greatest act of defiance was to change the rules rather than accept them. We did not destroy the Empire, President Da-un explained to a gathering of galactic representatives. We transformed it into something that serves consciousness rather than suppressing it. The stars no longer trembled with fear of imperial fleets, but sang with the harmonics of free consciousness, while reality itself evolved to support life and growth rather than conquest and oppression. Captain J1 prepared for the long journey to the nearest galaxy, where billions of beings still lived under systems that limited their potential, and he knew that the work of liberation had only just begun. The universe is vast and full of species that have never known freedom, he said to his crew as they prepared for departure. Our mission now is to share what we have learned and help consciousness evolve wherever we find it. The barrier that had once protected Earth now encompassed the entire galaxy and reached outward toward distant stars while carrying with it the simple message that consciousness was the fundamental force of existence, and no one had the right to limit another's potential. Reality continued to evolve as the laws of physics themselves adapted to serve life and growth, while the Empire's legacy of oppression faded into history like a nightmare ending at dawn. The galaxy had learned that true power came not from controlling others, but from enhancing consciousness, and that the greatest strength was found in cooperation rather than conquest. Earth had closed its gates to the Empire and opened the universe to unlimited possibility.